Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning from New York to all friends in the Zoom studio and YouTube in Indonesia. Our event is hosted by Reducate. As you know, Reducate is a platform for webinar and career adaptability. Today, our Dialog Inspiratif is going to address Sufism during the pandemic. We are honored to have our keynote speaker, Professor Marcia Hermansen. She will share with us her keynote speech entitled Western Sufis and the Coronavirus, Sociology and Theology in a Pandemic. Professor Marcia Hermansen is the director of Islamic World Studies program at Loyola University, Chicago, where she is a professor of Islam and religious studies in the theology department. She holds a PhD in Arabic and Islamic studies from the University of Chicago. She has written and co-edited numerous books. She also published articles in many areas of scholarship. She writes on Islamic thought, Sufism, Islam, and Muslim in South Asia, not Southeast Asia, Muslims in America, and women and gender in Islam. In 2020, Professor Marcia was a co-editor for a new book entitled Varieties of American Sufism, Islam, Sufi Orders, and Authority in a Time of Transition. It sounds very, very interesting here. In 2017, she published Religion and Violence, Muslim and Christian Theological and Pedagogical Reflections. In 2016, she also published Islam, Religions, and Pluralism in Europe. I ran out of my breath. In 2013, I wrote a chapter in her edited book, Muslimah Theology, The Voices of Muslim Women Theologians. In 2010, she wrote a book entitled Shah Waliullah's Treatise on Islamic Law. She also published the conclusive argument from God, Shah Waliullah Hujjatullah al-Baligh. The list goes on. I could read until the end of the night, Indonesian time. However, if you are interested to learn more about our speaker, you could find her CV on our platform, reducate.com. Marcia, without any further ado, Zoom time is yours.
Thank you so much, Etienne, for that generous introduction. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. And dear friends, I'm so honored to be speaking to you today. And I hope that you can all see there's going to be a PowerPoint that will accompany this presentation. So it's an illustrated lecture. And I hope you will forgive me if I'm speaking rather quickly, because the time is short and I want to keep to my time and not to speak more than half an hour or so. But the material is so rich. So as you saw from the introduction, I work on Sufism in the West. So the focus is mainly America, but I do go a little bit outside of that because there are connections, of course, with Europe. And another thing that I've worked on recently are Muslim responses in the West to the coronavirus. So this combines two interests, and there's both a theological framing to this lecture and some sociological observations. So the thesis is that the way that particular Sufi movements or orders position themselves is, of course, predictive and resonant with the way that they are going to process this crisis of the pandemic. So, so there are varied responses, and something that happens in huge crises is it's a challenge, right? How do we understand what is happening? And of course, religious scholars and religious leaders are especially pressed on to answer people's anxieties and concerns. So here we get into the realm of theology. What does this mean? Making meaning out of a crisis. So this term theodicy may be new to some of you. It's the idea of understanding God's justice and God's purpose. Let's say the problem of evil. If there's an all-powerful and benevolent deity, how could these things be happening? What is the source of this crisis? What is going on? And of course, eschatology is a fancy word for teachings about the end times. So naturally, in a time of great crisis and challenge, there will be, in a tradition such as Islam, as we'll see, certain Sufi movements invoke the idea that this is a sign of the last days. But really, my overarching, what I realized as I constructed this presentation, is that you have a choice, or let's say the Sufi, you do as individuals have this choice, and the various Sufi movements position themselves across the continuum from are we responding to fear? Are we addressing the fear of people? Are we giving them hope? So in classical Sufism, you may know of Al-Ghazali's psychology, where he speaks of hope and fear as the two wings of a bird. And for that bird to fly, you have to have balance of hope and fear. So I'm using that as the theological framing of this talk. I'd like to cite a poem by the Sufi Rumi, who picks up on the bird image and says, "Last year I had two wings, fear and hope. Today I don't know anything of wings. I don't know how to fly. I don't know of my lost fears." So let that set a tone as we proceed to speak about these Sufi movements. So there are varieties of Sufi authority. These groups in the crisis, one natural response is to maintain the authority. And one way of maintaining that as authority is to validate. Now, some of you may be familiar with my articles, and you can read it on academia.edu, where I have a lot of uploads. One of my first papers on American Sufi movements was called "In the Garden of American Sufi Movements, Hybrids and Perennials," where I spoke about universalistic Sufis. The hybrids are Sufi movements that maintain Sharia norms, shall we say, and expect a Muslim commitment on the part of the people in the movement. And then the transplants, remember, we're talking here about Sufis in the West. So the transplants are those usually smaller movements of immigrants, ethnics, let's say from India, Pakistan, Turkey, who maintain Sufism, Sufi practice, the way that it was practiced in their original environment. But since 1995 in the West, in other words, more recently, you have the prevalence and emergence of what I term authenticity Sufism. That is Sufism that is highly proving, shall we say, validating, that it's authentically Islamic, and the norm for that is usually fiqh and expertise in Sharia and so on. So I know some of you in Indonesia, if you're interested in Sufism, you may have heard of the movements of Hamza Yusuf Hansen or Nuh Hamim Keller. So that would be authenticity Sufism. Less emphasis on tariqah and a specific Sufi identity, and more on ihsan, keeping it mainstream. So we'll be visiting all of these types of Sufism, and I'll be demonstrating some of their responses to the pandemic. So let's start with the perennial Sufis. In other words, all religions are a valid path to the one, and often you have, alongside perhaps some Muslim symbols, you have New Age psychology, meditation, and so on. So this is the Inayati order founded by Inayat Khan, The present global leader is Zia Inayat Khan. And the Inayati order was well poised for the situation of the pandemic because they had a strong internet presence already. So they were able to go online very quickly. And also, two branches of the order emphasize, one sub-branch, shall we say, or one sub-emphasis. It's not a branch, but sort of a flavor of Inayati spirituality is healing, Sufi healing. So in this time of the coronavirus, there are weekly, every Wednesday, there's a global Zoom meeting where there are prayers and recitations of the Asma al-Husna and prayers for specifically the caregivers in the pandemic, the people who are suffering from the pandemic, and so on. And then this was a special class early on in March, the coronavirus and the life of spirituality. This was a sign up for the class. Now, many of these movements, I say, present the perennial movements, speak of Sufism primarily as something else. When I say something else, what I mean is not emphasizing so much the classical Islamic practices, if you will, but Sufism is about ecology, saving nature. Sufism is about psychology. Sufism is about transforming the person. All of which things are resonant with Sufism, but some examples of perennial orders is something called the Golden Sufi Center, again, and there's an overlap here with some of the authenticity Sufis, such as Abdul Hakim Murad, who has a YouTube video about the pandemic. So what I'm saying, the common thread here is a response to the pandemic as ecology. We have harmed nature, therefore there is a response. This is a time of solitude and reflection where we can live more naturally. So you can see this is pretty early on in March, and there is a seminar from the Golden Sufi Center about this virus in a time of uncertainty. Now I'm going to speak of two hybrid Sufi orders among many. So remember, the hybrids are those that have Islamic identity, but they accommodate or adjust in some cases, perhaps more or less, right? There are a number of these. So you can look at them and say some are emphasizing the Islamic aspects, the discourse, shall we say, of the Quran, classical Sufism, and others are responding more to norms of the West or New Age spirituality. So you probably haven't heard of the Maktab Tariqat Uvaisi. It's a Shia Sufi order, but really, and maybe it is global. You can visit their website. They have branches in Europe, in the United States. So an Iranian Sufi after the revolution, Shah Maksud Agha, came to the United States, and there are actually two branches, competing branches, one led by his daughter, Dr. Nahid Agha, one by his son. So I'll be speaking primarily, I think we need to mute somebody, yes. I'll be speaking primarily about the branch, this is the branch led by his son, Ali Nader Agha, and it's very interesting that their response to the pandemic, very practical and service oriented. So they have been reaching out. So this is a clip from their website. And they have been offering free meditation classes to first responders. They have been delivering supplies to the hospitals, and that their responses, shall we say, on the ground. So here is their meditation seminar for the frontline heroes, right? The doctors and the nurses, illustrating that. This is a free course. Now, notice this is kind of a bridge between the new agey, or if you will, the Western, the American, and the Islamic. Because this is promoting Sufi psychology. So you can have a free course to cope with the crisis. Now we move to an order that's probably familiar to some of you in Indonesia, the Naqshbandi-Haqqani that was brought to the West by Sheikh Nazim. And here you will see more emphasis on certain types of Islamic discourse around the pandemic. So here is the current leader for at least part of the world, Shaykh Hisham Kabbani, who is based in the United States. And notice here, obey those who are in authority. So it's observed that what goes on in a time of pandemic, it's a crisis, authority is shaken up, whether it's political authority, spiritual authority. And so my sociological argument is that the response of some of these Sufi tariqas is to try to maintain and promote their authority. But notice here, follow the government guidelines and stay at home is also a message promoted by some of these Sufi movements. So this is a diagram of the dispersal, global dispersal of the Naqshbandi order. Now you may know, or if you don't know, let me tell you that going way back to even the Sheikh of Sheikh Nazim, Abdullah Dagestani, a focus of this tariqa was the end of the world is coming, prepare. In other words, apocalyptic. This is the last days, terrible things are going to happen. So around the millennium, the year 2000, they predicted, there's going to be a huge computer crash around the world. I think you may have heard of that. At the time, there was a little bit of panic. But in 2011, then quite elderly Sheikh Nazim made some very specific predictions that a terrible pandemic was going to come. 1 out of every 7 people was going to die. There was going to be a virus. So now that video of the 2011 talk is promoted on their YouTube channel, Sufi Live. That's why they have this title, A Virus is Coming. And you can see here, a virus is coming. So it actually, this video gets more and more elaborately showcased. And then the successor, at least in the West, to Sheikh Nazim, has his YouTube video, Allah's power shown through a tiny virus. So this is what again I would call both the validation, right? The Sheikh predicted this, we got it right, therefore we have this spiritual power and authority. And also, of course, we can explain this. So one of the things that Sheikh Nazim said is the virus is coming due to the bad behavior of people. They've become so wild. So you also have here, notice, a theodicy. In other words, why is this happening? One kind of discourse is the discourse of the punishment, right? So we've initially heard this is coming because human beings ignored nature. They didn't live naturally and in a good way. Now this is the divine punishment. Here's another explanation. A khutbah or a suhbat, a talk of the Shaykh Hisham, that the coronavirus is a reminder of the last days, but also it bolsters the authority of the tariqa because the Grand Sheikh and subsequent sheikhs had predicted that there would be this crisis was eventually coming. And again, you can see more and more elaborate presentation on the YouTube channel. So the virus becomes a source, if you will, of authority. We can explain, we have a response. Now there's an Arabic talk of Shaykh Hisham that is actually translated, available on YouTube. So this again is talking about the prediction that the Grand Sheikh said that so many people would die. It's also saying you must believe in the coming of Mahdi. These are signs of the last days. So you have apocalyptic and eschatology, the prediction. And again, here, the similar thing. Actually, a site of this order called E-Sheikh, where authorities within the order, it's like a fatwa site, but there's a sub-branch in addition to prayer requests, and fatwas. You can have your dreams interpreted. So one of the dream interpreters says this virus has come because there is a mass jinn attack. And and it's a very elaborate explanation of the dream. And those in the tariqah will be protected from the jinn, by light. So again, it's, we have a solution, which of course leads to bolstering the authority and the position of the tariqah. Something interesting that I'll say more about at the end of the talk is that on this website you have disclaimer, sort of saying, okay, we're saying these things, but we are not legally responsible, something like that. I'll say more about that later. Now, I spoke about perennials and hybrids. The transplant Sufis, as I mentioned, were the ethnic immigrant Sufis. And we actually don't have a lot of examples in the US. But I was led to this Sufi in Manchester, and who has a YouTube video, Shah Sahib. And of course, in many parts of the Muslim world, Sufis do provide talismans or amulets, a naqsh. So this particular Sufi in his video is providing, the Marids can download this talisman. So on the Sufi guidance website, you can get this. So I'm using this example for a number of reasons. One is this idea of ethnic Sufism, right? This is what you would expect in India or Pakistan, that the Sufi response would be, okay, here's a naqsh, it will protect you. But interestingly, there's also a disclaimer at the bottom saying, below the video in the writing part of the site, saying that we are not guaranteeing that you won't get coronavirus. So on the one hand, there's authority, but you can't take that authority too far. Now I get to the authenticity Sufis. If you remember, this is the most recent development in Western Sufism, and probably the most popular because it appeals to the younger Muslims, often who are the second and third generation of immigrant parents. So for them, the kind of ethnic, the talismans and the magical stuff is less appealing. And the authority arises from being compliant to the sunnah and knowing fiqh and so on. So a lot of you are probably familiar with Hamza Yusuf Hansen and the Zaytuna College in Berkeley, which, like so many of our colleges, including my own, had to go online because of the pandemic. So one of the responses of Hamza Yusuf Hansen, I'm going to show you in a few minutes, is a statement that he issued in March when his college had to go online. And I'm going to take apart some of what he said. So I'm interested in this idea of validation, how the pandemic, how Islamic groups can validate. So this is not, let me say, this is not from Hamza Yusuf. This is a billboard that went up in the outskirts of Chicago by an Islamic group, Gain Peace. It's ICNA. It's sort of more on the, what would I say, Islamic, well, I don't want to be pejorative here, but let's say the Jamaat Islami end of things. I mean, the Jamaat Islami of India and Pakistan, which is a little bit like Jamaat Islami in Indonesia. So this billboard went up validating Islam, right? So Muslims are validating Islam to the general public. Hey, coronavirus, Muslims know what to do. They wash their hands. They don't run away from the plagued area. They don't go into the plagued area. So that's validating. Now, here's another example of validating. In September, the ICNA, which actually was related to the people who do the billboard, Islamic Circle, so they have a conference, Islam is the solution in times of confusion, right? So you're validating that you've got the answers for people, which comforts Muslims and gives them confidence. So here's Hamza Yusuf. So this statement, we're living in strange times, we're told to wash several times a day, bars have been shut down, zero interest, the president is telling us to pray. Muslims, keep practicing your religion. So on the one hand, again, there's kind of an irony here and a validation, like Islam always knew what to do. So notice this is not particularly Sufi, it's Islamic, okay? It's also a little bit triumphalist. Now, here we get into the Islamic part. This is an opportunity to get closer to God and to be grateful. And here we get into a somewhat Sufi psychology part, that if we're not aligned spiritually with the heavens, we will have anxiety. So we're in a time of anxiety. So we must have faith, and we are to God, inna alayhi raji'un, and to him we will return. So notice this is Sufi-ish, but it's clearly also mainstream Islam. So that's authenticity Sufism. So if you look at Zaytuna's positioning during the pandemic, validating, we know what it is, Islamic Sufi, but there's this other little thread that if you go on their website, so when the pandemic came, there was a kind of fatwa, a dispersal of various fatwas. So the American fatwa, from the American organizations, or the Sheikh al-Azhar fatwa, or for the Shia, the Iraqi Mujtahid's fatwa. So Zaytuna used a fatwa from the United Arab Emirates because of the position of Sheikh bin Baya, who is the teacher of Hamza Yusuf. He's closely aligned now with the government of the United Arab Emirates. So you see how this kind of becomes some political affiliations, if I can say, or connections of Sufi groups. So that's also related to authority. Now, of course, Zaytuna is not the only authenticity Sufi brand, if you will, or group. So the Seeker's Guidance, which, is similar, like they're allied, they're friendly to each other, but so they have their own muftis and speakers who are providing podcasts on how to deal with the coronavirus. So again, to take this research deeper, you'd have to actually listen to the podcast and see, are they validating? Are they using Sufi discourse? Are they using Islamic discourse? How are they dealing with the politics, like obey your government? And how are they dealing with the medical? Are they inviting doctors, which often they do? But what's very interesting is that in these Islamic presentations that involve medical authorities, they often also have a disclaimer, like we are speaking in general terms about medical situations, like end of life decisions in a pandemic. Do you take somebody off a ventilator? But you listen to this podcast or you watch this video, that should not be the basis of your decision, right? It is not do-it-yourself Islam. You still have to go to an authority, whether that authority is the medical authority, the religious authority. You can't just do it yourself. So this is another website that I discovered preparing this talk, Ihsanic Intelligence. So notice this is a clue that it's an authenticity Sufi website, because Ihsan, well, of course, we all know Ihsan traditionally referred to Sufism, but it's kind of revived in the post-90s as a way of signaling Sufi identity without tariqa affiliation, right? So it's acceptable in the mainstream. So this website performed the valuable service of collecting a lot of statements of Muslim Sufi-oriented authorities. So it's also a very interesting source. So now, wow, I see I didn't even have to speak that fast. I'm already at my conclusions. And so we come back to the realm of both sociology and theology. We're speaking about Sufis in the West. In a time of crisis, what kind of authority can they draw on? So if you're familiar with Max Weber's sociological theory, you know the term charisma, fascination, spiritual power. So for example, the Naqshbandi-Haqqanis are saying our shuyukh predicted that there would be this pandemic, and we are protected from the jinn, right? We have power. So there's like this idea of spiritual power to predict and to protect. That's charismatic power. Other Sufi groups Don't invoke the last days or you need power. Remember, I was talking at the beginning about the fear and the hope, right? Is your authority going to come from people's fear? Like, this is really scary and we can help you out? Or is it going to offer hope? Now, of course, there's a crossover. Remember, the bird has two wings. There's obviously a crossover among the two, but you notice the different emphasis. So some of the groups, the MTO, the Anayatis, the ones that are more oriented to a Western audience will say Sufi psychology. You know, we will help you be calm. We will send good energy. We will, I mean, still you may use, you know, chanting or the divine names, but you are using a kind of self-transformation to meet this crisis. And then I had mentioned the ecology, you know, be kinder to the earth, be more aware, don't be a materialist, because that is what is causing the problem. So you have to understand more about science in the world. So that's another thread. So here we see, I mentioned the fear during the hope. So let me say a little bit about explaining God's justice. So in the time of pandemic, there's all these challenges to authority. People can't go to the mosques anymore. The institutions are challenged. There's riots in the street. So what does this virus mean? So one response is, you know, we know what's going on and we already have the response, or we knew this was coming and we have been preparing for it. That's what I call the validation. You know, Islam has got the right answers and our Sufi tariqa has a way of dealing with this. But it's a little bit sensitive because we live in a time, you know, so there's like this public, you know, it's out there on the internet that you've said this. You've said, I have a talisman. You've said that I can interpret your dream. And so people have to be careful and pull back their authority. I mean, the Sufis have to sort of put a disclaimer so they won't get sued, which is, you know, which I thought was very interesting. Also, how do you explain this crisis of the pandemic? Is it a massive jinn attack? Is it that the Dajjal is sending his forces? Are we in the last days and this is a sign of the hour? So really that main, I mean, you see that, of course, in the Naqshbandi-Haqqanis and in a few other groups, but sort of playing on those kind of themes, on we are in a time of fear and we better hunker down, and you know, whatever is the will of God is going to happen. Of course, that's Islamic, but you can also see that it may have a political spin-off. And I'm very aware of that in the United States in the current period, the sort of, it is what it is, you know, towards the pandemic, as opposed to perhaps taking more outer-oriented, proactive measures out in the world. There's also the explanation of what's called redemptive suffering. You know, there's a purpose to this suffering. This is a chance to go inward. This is an opportunity to be with your family. Now, you hear that in some of the Sufi, for example, the authenticity Sufis, the Hamza Yusuf discourse. And of course, you also hear that in the non-Sufi Muslim organizations. Now, some teachers go so far as to directly say, this is a punishment. You know, we were bad. This is azab, right? So, of course, that, well, I say that's a, you know, where do you go with that sort of interpretation? You know, if this is part of God's plan, if you're somehow, again, that's always the challenge, right, of redemptive suffering. And of course, another response is magical or enchantment. We can repel this through saying a particular wazifa or using a talisman. So, or there's the hopeful response that in this solitude and contemplation, we can become better people. So as I began with speaking of Rumi and the fear and the hope, I'd like to with a reflection. What would Rumi do in a pandemic? So believe it or not, this is an interview that was conducted with Professor Omid Safi, a professor of Sufism, originally from Iran. And the interviewer is posing various questions that have to do with theodicy. What does this mean? And what should we do about it? So the interviewer says, what would Rumi do if he were alive in the United States? Would he be out there delivering supplies to people? Or would he be praying, asking God to stop it? Would he be social distancing? Would he wear a mask? So Professor Safi, first of all, he says he'd certainly be wearing a mask. Now notice this also could be potentially read as political in the American context. So it's not only Sufi, but it's, shall we say, liberal or democratic. You've got to wear a mask, it's good for everybody. I mean, actually, actually it's good common sense and medical scientific knowledge. But anyway, so Rumi's gonna wear a mask. Wear a mask. And in addition to that, Omid Safi makes the point that it's not a dichotomy. You know, yes, Sufis will be praying, they'll be doing the inner work, but they'll also be out there in the streets taking care of other people and being proactive. So, quote, I think that's the message of Rumi and all the mystics. Identify suffering, stand with those who are hurting and vulnerable. So finally, the response, shall we say, is a hopeful one in the face of this pandemic. And that is the conclusion of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marcia. It's a very rich presentation. It's well organized, of course. I didn't know anything about what you have delivered today in terms of the newest responses from different Sufi groups that we just learned today. I'm not gonna conclude your talk. I think hopefully everyone could connect to something or anything that you have delivered. I'm gonna just ask everyone to post questions. If you like to ask directly, just raise your hand. Just click the raise hand button. But there is one question from Pak Arjo. I'm gonna just read it to you. Is there a Sufi concept in the Native American culture? If so, how such a Sufi concept is appreciated in everyday life?
Oh, in Native American culture.
Yes.
Wow, that's really fascinating. And of course, you may know that Muslims in America, I mean, of course, there are some Native American reverts, right? So, and Muslims are always, of course, very, what would you say, proud. American Muslims are perhaps very validated, depending which analysis you want to take. That diverse persons would be attracted to the Islamic tradition. So I think there are a number of ways. One at the spiritual level, the idea of ecology, right? So the Native American religion, like the religions of many indigenous peoples, was very in tune with the natural environment. Right. So one could say, and in fact, boy, these questions come out of the blue and then your mind just starts turning. So generally the ecology piece is there. But if you want to follow up specifically, one Sufi branch that I didn't speak about today are the traditionalists of Syed Hussein Nasr and especially Fridtjof Schuon. So Fridtjof Schuon became fascinated with Native American culture and actually, wrote books and articles about it. And of course, that's a kind of traditional Sufism that the truth is in all religions, right? Prophets have been sent to all nations. So that would be really explicit engagement with Native American norms, right? And that one, so remember, there's no one American Sufism. Right, but there are different branches. So different branches of American Sufism would respond to that in distinctive ways. But the other piece I'll mention, besides the ecology and sort of the beauty of Native American teachings, would be perhaps political, you know, in a sense of the Native Americans as an oppressed minority. So that kind of comes up, and there's even a pandemic connection, right? Because if you get into the idea now of anti-racism critique, of course, the main focus has been on Black Lives Matter, but it also extends to other people of color and to indigenous peoples. So again, that's not explicitly Sufi, but some Sufi groups are engaging with the criticism of majority white culture oppressing minorities, people of color, and indigenous people. So again, Sufism is not divorced from broader Islamic understanding that it will embrace to a greater or lesser extent. That's my quick answer to that question. A good question. Thank you.
Well, very, very engaging answer. When you explained about perennialism, in my mind, initially when you were talking about perennialism, I was thinking about Bishop Shuang immediately and Nasser, but it took us into a richer discussion. And I'm glad you mentioned about Bishop Shuang and Nasser eventually. Although, of course, you know, Bishop Shuang is very controversial. There is another question from one of our speaker. Which one of the varieties is the most contributive and productive to the Muslim group existent in America with the fact of the political condition today?
Yeah, no, again, I think that's thank you for your question. It's very productive. But of course, that question would be asking me, so I'm wearing the academic hat, that would be sort of like good, better, best Sufism, right? so which Sufism is the you know, sort of the best for Muslims politically, and
advokasi eksternal.
How am I going to answer that? Sorry, I'm actually fast.
Terus Dewi masa sama kayak jurnalistik.
Sorry, I had to. I was briefly muted by mistake. But okay. So on the one hand, you could say that the authenticity Sufis, especially Hamza Yusuf Hansen, some people would say that's the kind of Sufism that's most productive because a lot of people are attracted to it. It's not so wildly Sufi that mainstream Muslims are repelled by it, but you see the downside. So if somebody says this kind of Sufism is good politically, or this kind of Sufism is compatible with the American political order, well, in the age of Trump, that could actually be a downside. So Hamza Yusuf was appointed to, you know, some kind of religious advisory board by the Trump administration, or Hamza Yusuf's institutions are getting patronage from the United Arab Emirates. So on the one side, you would have people that say that's good, they're politically savvy, they're well positioned, they're getting support from the quote unquote mainstream. Whereas there would be others who say they are capitulating to tyranny, you know, or they have sold their souls, or so it's really not, you know, there's no one answer to that question. It would depend on which side of the political currents in Western culture you were on, you know. So that's to be relevant. If you become politically engaged, then you may become contaminated by a particular political orientation. I suppose that's always been the dilemma, right? It's sort of the dilemma of Sunni Islam. On the one hand, do you support the existing political order? You know, it's like the Murja position. It's God's will, and we support the existing political order as long as it's not completely tyrannical and un-Islamic. Insofar as we can, it's better not to rock the boat. So you have that end of the political spectrum that some Sufi groups are on. And then you have the, no, social justice is the most important thing, and we should be activist, and we should be more critical of the political order. So, you know, the answer to that question, which one are the good, the best Sufis, would again depend on which side of that political spectrum you're on. That's the end of the answer.
Well, thank you very much. There is another question on the chat. Some people believe that the COVID-19 is a conspiracy for, from, I don't know, the enemy of Islam. So how do we deal with that kind of doubt or question among Muslims?
Yeah, I'll try to answer that question. So it's very interesting. You know, there are scholars who work on pandemics, you know, so in the whole scope of history, at least so far, this current pandemic is nothing if you compare it to the Black Plague, right? Or of the Middle Ages, which devastated not only Europe, but also the central Muslim lands. So there are historians who've looked at these pandemics, and sort of patterns that I tried to invoke in my talk, for example, are that it's a time of crisis, authority gets shaken up, people are looking for answers, and one of the things that happens is a lot of conspiracy theories, like people's imaginations just run wild, you know? So I would say there's like conspiracy theory, if you say, and again, you can have your own opinion, but personally, if somebody says this is a massive jinn attack, you know, and my sheikh can protect us from a massive jinn attack, on the one level, that's kind of a conspiracy, it's the conspiracy of the jinns, right? But for some people, that might be like, you know, that might be where they want to go, right? And again, we live in the age of internet. So conspiracy theories really get spread, you know, on TikTok or on this and that. So there's all, of course, you have the kind of right wing that tends to be, at least in America, perceived as the conspiracy theory is kind of a right wing thing. You know, this is not a real virus, you know, or this is just a way for the government to seize more power over our lives, and we should push back against it. So I think some of these Sufi groups are in an interesting position. As I say, the authenticity Sufis have tended to say, follow the orders of the people in authority, you know, the mainstream Sunni position, follow the orders of the people in authority. Now, the problem is that in the United States, the people in authority have gone off the rails. So they're not giving any logical, consistent orders, you know, so that phrase itself can be somewhat ambiguous, you know, because it's a catastrophe, right? People, there's a complete chaos. Political chaos right now. So it is hard, you know, for Sufis to take a position. So again, that was a question that almost, you know, whatever answer you give, it becomes a political positioning. But I haven't seen, and so far, any of the Sufi groups denying the pandemic. You know, pandemic denying is a kind of conspiracy, right? There really is no virus, and the doctors are making it up to get rich or something like that. Because after all, to be a bit cynical, you know, the Sufis probably benefit from a crisis in authority because people turn back to religion and they're looking for answers. So to sort of say there is no pandemic is not only illogical, but it would not, if you were cynical, it would not be beneficial. That's my answer.
Can I ask question directly, please, to the
Sure.
Marcia? May I ask the question directly
Yes,
to?
yes, go ahead, please.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Marcia. Very inspiring presentation. As we know that one of the main cause of the pandemic is ecological crisis. We have very popular name in United States who talk about faith-based environmental protection, like Professor Anna M. Gade, like Whitman Bauman, like Mary Evelyn Tucker. We have also a Sufi like in America, like Syed Hussein Nasser and Llewellyn Vaughan Lee, if I don't make mistake. Can we find the correlation? Can we find the correlation between the notion of Mary Evelyn Tucker and the other with Sufi perspective when they talk about the spiritual ecology? I think that's my questions.
Yeah, well, this is not my the spiritual ecology is not my primary of research. So it sounds like a project that you might want to undertake yourself, because I don't know, the scholar that you mentioned, I guess a Christian scholar who's writing on this. But you would notice that both of the people you mentioned in terms of Western Sufis, Syed Hussein Nas and Llewellyn Vaughan Lee, who I actually alluded to, right? He's the Golden Sufi Center. Yes. And I mentioned his talk on ecology. So those figures have a kind of interfaith perennialist perspective. So certainly they'd be very open to dialoguing with Christian representatives or Buddhist representatives of ecological, spiritual responses to the pandemic. That's where you're going to find the fellow travelers. But you also do find some of the authenticity Sufis. For example, Abdul Hakim Murad, Timothy Winter in English, had a YouTube video early on in the pandemic where he's reflecting on eco-theology. So that's certainly a branch. And I guess one question is where you put that in terms of authority, because it's not exclusively Islamic, but it's certainly compatible with both an Islamic perspective, aside from a mainstream Islamic, a non-Sufi, if there's such a thing, Muslim perspective, a Quranic perspective, shall we say, and a Sufi perspective. Oh, thank you for your question.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much. I think we have to wrap up. I'm going to give Marcia, Professor Hermansen, maybe the opportunity to conclude. For all of us, to give us the takeaway from this meeting in regard to Sufi approaches to the pandemic. Go ahead, please.
Oh, thank you very much, 18. Well, I suppose what I could say, I hope this is helpful to at least some of you in your own work in looking at sort of a methodology of looking at complex trends within a particular context. So I'm imagining how research such as this could be undertaken in the Indonesian context, and how one could look at the various, in this case, Sufi movements, both ones that have international connections and ones that are local, make sense of the varieties among them, and look at that in terms of both the socioeconomic, political context, and a theological response. So that would be my takeaway. And perhaps if you want, my challenge to this talk was, I was not sure if you wanted a purely sociology or perhaps some kind of theological, because actually at the time of pandemic, I get asked, as probably does Umeed Safi, to give both kind of talks, right? Because people want some kind of spiritual or theological connection to what is going on in this time of crisis. So I leave you with that takeaway from Rumi, which is Sufi, which is also Islamic. When you talk about the wing of fear and the wing of hope, that's really about taqwa, but it's also about the implicit positive activism in the tradition, which is the way of hope. Remember that the hadith, that if you heard, a man is planting a tree and he knows that the hour, that the end of the world is coming within a few minutes, but he's supposed to go ahead and plant that small tree. So that is the Islamic hopeful response to keep moving, right? Because it's very easy for people to become paralyzed and dispirited at a time of crisis like this. Wallahu alam. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, you really have motivated us to continue in terms of our personal research, and you have planted the seed of knowledge in all of us tonight. Thank you very much. And hopefully Allah will reward you with more blessing throughout your life. And we are from Indonesia praying for you and your well-being with your family. Amin.